Now it's my pleasure to bring to you Miss Veronica Hammerling and her paper, Fidelity Under Attack, the Odyssey of Marital Drama.
What if a wife decided to reject fidelity to her husband and take up with another man? How much more disastrous would the consequences be if she was a mother? To complicate the matter further, imagine that the woman also happens to be a queen. And all the while this is happening, her husband is away, confronting invitation after invitation to abandon his wife for immortal goddesses and wealthy princesses. This is the picture Homer gives of Odysseus and Penelope's marriage at the opening of the Odyssey. Odysseus has to battle to get home, facing threats to his life, but also threats to his mission. He is tempted with false homecomings, opportunities to forget his family and identity and to become someone else. He does fall to temptation once, and his men have to remind him of his true home. After this fall, he is less taken in by the other attempts to ensnare him. Yet, while Odysseus is away, the fidelity of his home is under attack and is crumbling. The longer he is gone, the worse the situation gets. Young men are courting his wife, sleeping with his slaves, threatening his son, and eating their way through his wealth. Penelope herself is only mortal, and how much longer can she stand under this pressure? The poem begins in Ithaca to show what would be lost if Odysseus does not return in time. The conquests on his journey mean nothing if he returns to find his wife and home taken from him. The Odyssey is often seen as a rollicking tale of the dangers and adventures Odysseus faces before getting home to his faithful wife, but Homer tells a different story. It is a story of a marriage that could fall apart at any moment, yet it ends in triumph. Penelope stays strong, Odysseus wins back his wife, and finally their home is put to rights. The suitors are the most important challenge Odysseus has to face, because they are a direct attack on his marriage and his home. Poseidon, Polyphemus, Calypso, even Circe all seem to be more consequential and certainly more immediate threats and far more worthy opponents, yet those threats are only obstacles and distractions on the way of reaching home. The only reason Odysseus needs to overcome them is because he wants to get back to Penelope and Ithaca. But they are all, in one way or another, deserving adversaries. Their strength, power, and cunning were all great, and thus Odysseus' victories over them brought him glory. The suitors, by comparison, are cowardly brutes, shameless enough to live on another man's wealth. In gross violation of the code of hospitality, they glut themselves on the cattle and grow drunk on the wine of a better man, cavorting with his slaves at night, while by day they commit an even greater transgression against Odysseus, namely their intent of courting his wife. These men have no respect for the invisible barrier between themselves and any woman who has promised herself in marriage. All they know is that Penelope is beautiful and wealthy, and that they want her. They say they are men, yet they are slaves to their appetites. They think of themselves as warriors, but none are battle-tested. Despite their baseness, these suitors are the larger problem because they are a direct threat to Odysseus' goal, a danger to his home itself. If Odysseus returns to find his son dead, his wife with the new man, and his wealth consumed by the suitors' excessive feasting, his victory over Polyphemus and his escape from Calypso will have been in vain. The suitors cannot even be considered an honorable foe. There is no Hector among them. Their number alone is what possesses any challenge to Odysseus slaying them all with ease. While the suitors themselves are an unworthy challenge to the hero, the victory of Odysseus reclaiming his home and saving his marriage is far sweeter than any of his conquests along the way. Penelope is trapped between two competing claims of duty and virtue. If Odysseus is dead, then it is her responsibility to marry the man her father names and she prefers, and bear her new husband and heir. This would strip her first son, Telemachus, of his inheritance and put his life in danger. Indeed, Telemachus' safety is already threatened by the presence of her suitors. And what if it turns out that Odysseus is alive after all? Nestor warns Telemachus of this because such a situation happened with Agamemnon, the chief of the Greek kings. Aegisthus, a cowardly man, hid when the warriors left for Troy. After they had departed, he oozed his way into the house of Atrides Agamemnon, making light talk to win Agamemnon's queen. Clytemnestra was faithful to her husband at first, but eventually gave in to Aegisthus' advances and took him as her lover. When Agamemnon returned, the coward ambushed and killed him. Her unfaithfulness sparked a bloody revenge cycle, and she died at the hands of her own son Orestes. Now Telemachus and the audience are faced with a grim question. Will Odysseus, Penelope, and Telemachus end up like Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, and Orestes? Or what if their situation becomes like that of Menelaus and Helen? Helen's infidelity to her husband is what led to Odysseus leaving for war in the first place. After the war, Helen is once again under her husband's roof, but they have no true reunion. Menelaus is suspicious, Helen is angry, both are publicly resentful. This too is a possible outcome for the house of Laertes. The only difference is that Penelope is a mother and would be dragging her own son into danger by her adultery. If Odysseus is alive, Penelope's faithfulness is necessary to maintain peace, order, and stability in their kingdom. With her home overtaken by suitors, she has to be very careful. She cannot outright reject her suitors because they have essentially taken over her home. So, she managed to string them along for years, never making definite promises or outright denials. Finally, she is betrayed by her own slave, who told the suitors of her pulling out by night the day's weaving. Now her time is running out. Penelope cannot evade them forever. The audience can only hope that she is able to withstand them long enough. All around Penelope, fidelity is breaking down, and the question of how long her faithfulness will last looms heavily in the minds of all around her. Many of her slaves have already abandoned their loyalty to Odysseus. Herdsmen have given up hope of their king's return. Even worse, a great number of Penelope's slave women have transferred their loyalty from their mistress to the men who are supposedly courting her, going so far as to sleep with her mistress's suitors. The worst of these treacherous slave women is Melantho, who was taken as a ward in childhood by Penelope, who raised her as her own. This girl felt no gratitude or affection towards the mistress who had been so kind to her, or even a sense of duty. Instead of attending to Penelope in the evening, entertaining her or keeping her company, Melantho goes off with Eurymachus, her favorite of her mistress's suitors. At the opening of the poem, the suitors have discovered through her slaves how Penelope tricked them and put off her choice in accepting one of them. Because of this betrayal, Penelope's situation becomes even more desperate, and her plan to avoid a new marriage has crumbled. However, not everyone has forsaken the memory of their king. Eumaeus, the swineherd, though believing Odysseus has died, remained faithful to his memory and lamented the state of his master's house. Odysseus had treated him well and had promised to find Eumaeus a wife to take care of him in old age. In this way, Eumaeus can be considered the opposite of Melantho. While Melantho had been raised by Penelope and given all sorts of gifts, she showed no loyalty to the mistress who had been so generous to her, and instead betrayed Penelope and slept with her suitors. Eumaeus, on the other hand, continued to be loyal to Odysseus, even though it seemed like the promises of a wife and security in old age would never be realized. Penelope has a choice in front of her. She can either go the route of Melantho or the route of Eumaeus, and her time to choose is running out. Because of Odysseus' absence and Penelope's suitors, Telemachus has grown up in a very difficult situation. He's on the cusp of manhood, but has had no father to show him how to be a man. All the men, like his father, have been off at war, leaving Telemachus and many others to be raised solely by the women. All his life he's been told how great a hero Odysseus is. But what does it mean to be the son of such a man? More immediately on his mind is the fact that his home is overrun with suitors and he cannot do anything about it. The boy's own words put it best. They eat their way through all we have, and when they will, they can demolish me. If Penelope remarries, her new husband's child will be the heir. Any confusion regarding succession is a danger to the stability of the kingdom. Telemachus will be seen as a threat, and so will be killed. Indeed, even while Penelope evades the choice, Telemachus is in danger. When he goes off in search of news for his father, the suitors plan to ambush and kill him. They fail in this attempt, but that failure will not be the end of the story. Even without his mother remarrying, the suitors are stripping him of his birthright with their excessive feasting. Odysseus' wealth is not in heaps of gold locked away in a storeroom. His wealth is in his land, his cattle, and his stores of wine. It was built up and passed down to him from his ancestors and is meant to be handed down to Telemachus. In the beginning of the Odyssey sees Telemachus, a boy daydreaming of his father's return. He longs for the great Odysseus to appear, kill all the suitors, and take his place as king again. Only when Odysseus is king and Penelope his wife and queen will Telemachus have a secure place in society. After setting the stakes, the story returns to its hero. Odysseus' journey is famously long, dangerous, and full of many fascinating stops. Some of the most significant episodes of his journey are false homecomings. False homecomings are temptations for Odysseus to give up his goal of returning to Ithaca and to stay where he landed forever. Each offer is different, and the invitations to stay grow more enticing. Just as Penelope is tempted to reject her identity as Odysseus' wife and Telemachus' mother by remarrying, Odysseus is also invited to reject his place and identity. Without his father, son, Odysseus is trapped in the present. Without his kingdom, he is a wanderer. Without his wife, he is alone. If Odysseus does not reach home, he loses his identity and truly becomes Uthis. The false homecomings are, in a sense, substitutes for Penelope. Odysseus is offered all the benefits of a homecoming without the hard work of getting back to his wife and being the man she deserves. The longer he is away from home, the longer he leaves his family in danger. He does not know of their danger until he has fallen into temptation once. After that fall, Odysseus gains a sense of urgency in his mission to reach home. He grows more able to withstand the offers of false homecomings and longs even more strongly for his true wife and home. Odysseus' first temptation to abandon his journey is on the island of the Lotus Eaters. The inhabitants, who lived upon the lotus flower, showed no will to do them harm, only offering the sweet lotus to the men. This was a dangerous offer, as that flower was a drug of pleasant numbness and forgetfulness. Those men who ate the honey plant, the lotus, never cared to report nor to return. They longed to stay forever, browsing on that native bloom, forgetful of their homeland. The lure of the island is to stay in oblivion, satisfying the palate with the sweet flower. Odysseus is given the opportunity to forget the horrors of war, the pain of separation from his wife, exchanging all difficult memories for vacuous pleasure. He can feel the pleasure of his return without any of the difficulty, but he would lose himself. He would have no responsibilities, no relationships, no identity. Our hero never hesitated for a moment. The offered lotus held no sway with him. He dragged his men back, wailing to the ships, and tied them down under their rowing benches, and ordered the crew to back out to sea. Odysseus would rather remember the suffering in his life and strive to return to the home he left over a decade ago, rather than forget everything for meaningless pleasure. Odysseus does forsake his home on Aiaia, the island of the witch Circe. Interestingly enough, this false homecoming is the only one that was not offered. Circe did not ask him to stay with her forever. Hermes, when instructing Odysseus on how to free his men from the witch's enchantment, said that he must not refuse her bed. Yet Odysseus chose to stay with Circe until an entire year had gone by, and his men had to tell him to shake off this trance and think of home, if home indeed awaits. The poem describes Circe like a dark, twisted version of Penelope. She is beautiful, clever, talented at the loom, like Penelope. She has no patience for men who are not worthy of her and easily tricks them, changing them into wild beasts. Yet, however like she may seem, Circe is not the woman Odysseus married. When Odysseus is finally reminded of his home, Circe willingly gives him good advice for his journey. She tells him how to reach the underworld and speak with the shade of Tiresias. It is there that Odysseus learns of Agamemnon's death and the suitors to his own wife. After succumbing to temptation once and learning that men are after his wife, Odysseus becomes more resolved than ever to return to his true home. The next false offer of home is on the island of the goddess Calypso. Odysseus washed on the shore of her island, his ship destroyed and his crew all dead. Calypso is fascinated by Odysseus and keeps him with her for 8 years. She desires his attraction and devotion and does not care that he desperately wants to leave. Odysseus is trapped because his only hope of seeing his home again is to stay alive. In order to stay alive, he must submit to Calypso's advances until he can escape. Calypso tries her best to convince Odysseus to love her, and 8 years is an incredibly long time for fidelity towards one wife to be constantly under assault. Indeed, he is only freed from Calypso because Athena tells Zeus that he lives and breathes on that island, enthralled into the nymph. He cannot stir, he cannot fare homeward. And she begs freedom for the hero. Zeus then sends Hermes to Calypso, bearing him a message commanding that she must send Odysseus back on his journey home. At first, Calypso is angered for being told to give up her favorite, but she cannot disobey Zeus. After Hermes leaves, the manipulative goddess goes to Odysseus, forlorn on the shore, and tells him, "I have pondered it, and I shall let you go." She does not tell him this without making one last attempt to convince him to stay with her. She tells him that she can make him immortal, and slyly points out that no mortal woman can compare to a goddess in beauty. To this, the strategist Odysseus answered perfectly that although Penelope cannot compare to Calypso, for she is mortal and will grow old and die, still he only longs for his true home. While the goddess can capture Odysseus, she cannot capture his affections. Odysseus was stuck for 8 years with a goddess who was madly in love with him, and he did not give up his desire for Penelope. He rejects unchanging beauty for his true wife and identity, even when he's been separated from his wife for over a decade. The final offer to abandon his home is the most enticing, yet Odysseus is able to stand firm. After leaving Calypso, Odysseus is washed up on the shore of Scheria, the home of the Phaeacians. He is found by the beautiful and gracious princess Nausicaa, daughter of Alcinous. The poem portrays Nausicaa as a paragon of Greek maidenhood. She is beautiful, obedient to the goddess Athena. She honors her parents, understands her duties as their daughter, is considerate of the needs of others, even her slaves, is gracious to strangers, and is quick thinking and prudent. In essence, Nausicaa is like a younger version of Penelope. The principal industry of her kingdom is weaving, strengthening that comparison. Adding to the attractions of her person and character, she is the only daughter of the king of an idyllic and prosperous land. From the moment she first sees him, Nausicaa treats Odysseus with honor and respect. She provides him with new clothes and invites him to be with her father's guest. She knows her family well and tells Odysseus that on mother's feeling much depends. If she looks on you kindly, you shall see your friends under your own roof in your father's country. In the palace, Odysseus is shown hospitality befitting his kingship. Indeed, the king and queen of the Phaeacians are so taken with him that Alcinous tells him, "My daughter should be yours, and you my son-in-law if you remained." Odysseus is given the opportunity to have the life of Nausicaa that he lost, he never had with Penelope. He could enjoy the years with his young wife, watching his children grow up that he missed with Penelope and Telemachus. He could have wise, loving parents-in-law and be the heir to a large and wealthy kingdom. But Odysseus never considers accepting the offer, even though it seems almost insane to refuse. Still, the gracious king and queen entertained him royally. Odysseus told them the story of his many perils over the years following the war at Troy. In the end, Alcinous provides his guest with a ship and crew to sail the rest of the way back to Ithaca, and sends Odysseus home with many lavish gifts. While Odysseus does not take Nausicaa as his wife, he leaves Scheria for his home on a royal vessel, laden with treasures and the king's friendship. Now, with Odysseus back on Ithaca, the hard work of reuniting him and Penelope can begin. When Odysseus first sees his wife again, he is disguised as a beggar among the suitors. Athena, who had been helping him from the beginning, meant to set Penelope's beauty high before her husband's eyes, and gave the queen a desire to address the suitors. But first, Athena made her sleep, and while she slept, the goddess endowed her with immortal grace to hold the eyes of the Achaeans. Penelope appeared before the men to announce that she was prepared to choose one of them. But first, she admonished the suitors for their lack of manners, telling them that it was they who should be giving her cattle rather than them living at her expense. Odysseus' heart laughed upon hearing this, her sweet tones charming gifts out of the suitors with talk of marriage, though she intended none. Like Circe, Penelope can easily fool men who are unworthy of her, though unlike the witch, all Penelope can do is temporarily hold them off. It is up to Odysseus to drive the suitors out of his home. Later in the evening, Penelope comes to interview her new guest. She seems to sense that there is something different about him, but whether the stranger is a god in disguise or her husband returned, she is not certain. She asks his history, but the disguised Odysseus begs her, "Do not enforce me to recall my pain." Odysseus does not want to lie to her, but when she insists, He tells her an elaborate tale of his life on Crete and how he met her husband once. Penelope is moved by his story and confides in the stranger. She tells him how she longs for her husband, of her leaving and her mate's betrayal, and how she has no strength left to evade a marriage. She leaves him briefly while Euryclea bathes him, but soon returns. Her excuse is that she had a dream she wants interpreted, although it seems more likely that she really suspects the stranger might be Odysseus. She tells him her dream. The suitors were fat beasts feeding on her grain, and Odysseus as a mountain eagle came down and broke their necks. Then she tells of the test for her hand, one only Odysseus can win. The stranger tells her not to postpone the trial, promising that her husband would be there to win her back. Penelope ends the interview with an invitation and a warning. You can stretch out on the bare floor, or else command a bed. She makes it very clear that Odysseus must win her back or die trying. The next day, the stage is set for Odysseus to prove himself worthy of his wife. Whichever man can string Odysseus' bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads wins the queen. While the suitors are distracted with the challenge, Telemachus quietly removes their weapons from the hall. After all the men have failed, Odysseus in beggar's guise asks to attempt the challenge. Telemachus ordered his mother and her attendants to their rooms to spare them from the scene to come. With ease, Odysseus strung his old bow, shot his arrow through the line. Immediately, he threw off his rags and began raining destruction on the heads of the suitors. Telemachus fetched a spear, shield, and armor for each of them and joined his father. Eumaeus and all the men still loyal to Odysseus fought for their king. None of the suitors escaped the hands of Odysseus and his followers. Even Athena, in the shape of Mentor, joined the reckoning. When the slaughter was over, Odysseus ordered the disloyal slave women to cleanse the hall from its bloodbath, afterward having Telemachus hang them as their punishment. Penelope, however, will not accept Odysseus immediately. She has a second test prepared for him. She ordered Euryclea, the old nurse, to have Odysseus' bed brought down to him. Odysseus was angered when he heard this, for their bed had been their secret. An old trunk of olive grew like a pillar on the building plot of their bedroom. Odysseus himself had cleared off the branches and used the trunk as a post of their bed. But no one, save himself and Penelope, was to know. Joyfully, Penelope embraced her true husband, knowing it was him. Finally, that night, the royal pair mingled in love again, and afterwards lay reveling in stories. Odysseus passed both tests, proving himself worthy to be restored to his rightful place as king of Ithaca and husband of Penelope. The poem does not end here, however, for there is more to. The poem does not end here, however. For there to be complete resolution between Odysseus and Penelope, the suitor problem must be finished. Their families have come seeking vengeance for the slain young men. Odysseus immediately prepares for battle with Telemachus at his side, but Athena, daughter of Zeus, who bears the storm cloud as a shield, ordered that he call off the fighting or face the wrath of her father. Odysseus yielded to her, and his heart was glad. At long last, the wanderer, harried for years on end, could rest. Odysseus is home, Penelope is free, and they can begin their life together again. The Odyssey is not just about the many adventures of Odysseus on his way home. It shows Odysseus and Penelope facing attacks on their marriage at every turn, but despite all odds, they triumph over temptation and are reunited at last. Odysseus encounters many instances where he could have the pleasure of home without the struggle of the journey. Penelope is surrounded with men, witnesses daily the infidelity of her household, and has to battle against the despair that she might never again see the husband of her youth. But instead of succumbing to their situations, the king and queen both fight for their spouse they have been separated from for 20 years. Even after Odysseus fails and stays with Circe, he becomes even firmer in his resolve not to abandon his true home. He proves his worthiness to Penelope twice over, and she welcomes back her long-awaited husband. The drama of the king and queen of Ithaca is finally over.
Thank you very much for your description in terms of the difficulties that face the marital relationships in the story. It is a nice perspective to understand the story through.
I guess when you're describing Nisikia, it does look like Odysseus is really presented with an opportunity for a reset. Here is a very substantial kingdom, a very eligible young princess that could give him the opportunity to begin over rather than returning to a situation that is fraught with peril, and as we know from Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, possibly fatal to his own life. And yet he does not take that choice. He seems to be determined and, in a sense, cannot make another choice. He has to go back to Penelope. The contrast that is coming to my mind is a contrast with Aeneas. Aeneas does make a choice, and he chooses to leave Dido, and he chooses to go and found a new land in Latium and to marry Lavinia. And so Aeneas makes the choice that Odysseus doesn't, which makes me think, well, Odysseus could have made a different choice too. How would the story have been different if Odysseus had chosen to reestablish a new land with Nisikia?
I think that, as I brought up a few times, that would be forsaking his own identity. He would be lying to himself, because he had married Penelope, and that really changed his identity. Now he's the husband of his woman. Of this woman. He's a father. He is the king of Ithaca. So he has all of these ties, all of these responsibilities that he needs to uphold. Whereas it seems with Aeneas, those have not been realized yet. He has not reached this land. He has not met Lavinia. It's only the gods say, this is the land that we want you to take. This is what you're going to do when you get there. But for Odysseus, that's so much more tangible and real, because he had already had some time to live that out. So I believe that was one of the main differences, is because for Odysseus it was more real to him, because he had already started that life, whereas with Aeneas it was completely foreign. Also, throughout, I think there are all these ties where Athena's like, Odysseus needs to get home. Odysseus needs to get home. Whereas with Aeneas, it was all, Aeneas needs to get here. He can't be with Dido. This is a distraction. So I think those are two of the main differences, where it's like their identity is this specific land, where it's Aeneas, he needs to go here, with Odysseus, he needs to go to Ithaca. But I think the fact that Aeneas hadn't seen his new land, hadn't seen his bride yet, that really, I think that affected what he had to do on his journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem that Odysseus remains true to this one idea, and yet he must not have been married to Penelope very long. He doesn't really specify how long they were married. When he left Telemachus, he was just most likely a very small baby, and so though he has established this home, it has not been for very long. And in the Gorgias, and when Socrates is talking to Callicles says we're oftentimes, you might say, bewitched by ties and binds that we can cast off. And Callicles says we have all of these things that are told to us. Be kind to the weaker one. Always fair shares for everybody. And he says, when somebody rises up as a man, he throws off those bonds. Is Odysseus's continuance in pursuing Penelope a sign of weakness, that he doesn't have the ability to redefine himself and pursue something that is really probably more to his immediate advantage than the continuance of his connection with Penelope?
I would say no, because he has so many more ties on him than just Penelope. Penelope is obviously very important, but I didn't have the time to address this in his paper, but his father is also there, and his father is still alive, and he has a responsibility to honor and love and take care of his aging father. And he can't leave his land uncared for. He has responsibility as the king as well. So I think in this case, he proves himself more the man for fighting harder to get back to this land and this family that he has been missing for so long, than to just try to like, oh, I'll restart, it'll be easy. He could have whoever he wanted. He could have had Nausicaa, he could have had Calypso, but he said, no, I'm gonna fight for what I left, and it might not even be the same as when I left it. You know, it's been 20 years since I've seen my wife. Obviously, I'm a different man. She's grown since I've seen her. Like, this is different, but he's still willing to fight for that, even though he knows it's not going to be the same as when he left it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up being a man, and that little line in Hamlet's very nice about what a man is. When I think it's his mother says for him to throw off the grief that he has over his father's death like a man, and he replies, yes, but I must feel it like a man. You know, what is it to be a man? To feel those things or to throw off those feelings. And so here, Callicles seems to think that being a man means to throw off these bonds. And you seem to be saying that to be a man is to submit to these bonds. And so why is it that being a man means being submitted to something rather than having the strength to break that off?
I think in this case, with Odysseus proving his manhood in regards to these feelings, he knows when it is the right time to mourn and the right time to put that aside and focus on the task at hand. You see this when he's reunited with Telemachus. They have a moment where they're like, we're finally together. His son is grown, and he hasn't seen him since he was an infant. And they share this very tender moment, but Odysseus finally is like, okay, now's not the time for crying, we have work to do. And he knows when it is proper to submit to these feelings and know that this is a very real pain that he has, and it's not wrong for him to say like, this is hard, this is awful. But then he also knows, like, I can't stay like this. I need to do something about it. So I think in this case, being a man, in regards to this, means knowing when it is appropriate to let yourself feel these feelings and submit yourself to these feelings, and when it is time to be the master and like overcome this and say, well, I need to do something about it. I can't just stay like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and entering into marriage seems to be a very strong point of differentiating that identity. I was a little late this morning. I was watching my brother in the middle of Africa, People's Democratic of Congo, giving his daughter away in a dowry ceremony to a very fine young man there. And thinking of my niece and saying she will no longer be attending Minnie Henrik's family get-togethers. And she is no longer saying, I'm an American and I will be here to support my country. She's giving up a huge amount of, you might say, what has been her identity to united marriage with someone from a different culture and different background and different family. And that is a huge step. And you bring up Penelope here when Odysseus is returning to her and looking to reestablish that marital bond. She asks a huge amount of him. I like the way that you interpret the line. You say when she says, you can stretch out on the bare floor or else command the bed. Basically subtly saying that, as you say, she makes it very clear that Odysseus must win her back or die trying. Now, and so in a sense, Penelope, before she really reunites with him, is throwing down a challenge and saying, you will not get me unless you are willing to risk your life. Now, is it ever rightfully a woman's place to give such a challenge to one who would like to, you might say, mess with her identity?
I would say, especially in this instance, it is appropriate considering all that's going on around her. She has all these very unworthy men who've been surrounding her for years, and like, she doesn't want any of that. She wants a man who's worthy of her, and she needs to know that Odysseus is still that man. And so in this case, she's like, this is the problem that arose because you were not here. And so if you want to be here, you have to deal with this problem. So I suppose in this case it would be appropriate considering their circumstances. I'm not sure if in every case such a challenge is warranted, but I think there should be some sort of questioning or some sort of like observing the character of, you know, when a woman is looking at a man saying, like, are you really worthy of me? Like, are you man enough to become a husband? And that is very important because, you know, marriage takes two adults who know how to sacrifice and who know how to love the other person and to take care of the other person. So if Odysseus is not that, then he doesn't deserve Penelope, who's been giving up so much for him for years.
Thanks very much. Other questions?
Yes, Annika.
So first off, lovely presentation, lovely paper.
Thank you.
And I noticed like in the beginning you're kind of talking about Menelaus and Helen as well as Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, and you can tell their relationship did not last because of infidelity. And I was just wondering how you kind of compare what were different for Odysseus and Penelope compared to that.
That's good. I think the biggest difference, I think, would be in how Penelope responded to her circumstances, because you see in both of these cases, it was, you know, Clytemnestra submitting to Aegisthus, or Helen, I suppose within the Odyssey, it seems that Helen agreed to go with Paris. So there was a choice on both their parts to leave their husbands for these, frankly, just, you can't even really call them men, they're just awful. But they decide to go with these unworthy men. And I'm not sure if it is because maybe Agamemnon and Menelaus aren't so great. I don't know. You see Helen's return, and this is just, they start fighting in public, and you're just like, oh, there is something seriously wrong here. Menelaus may have her back, but he doesn't completely have her back. She doesn't love him, and he doesn't really love her. I think this is just a bad situation overall, but Penelope still loves Odysseus, and she really feels that with Odysseus gone, she has lost a significant part of her life. And throughout the Odyssey, I didn't really have time to bring this up, but every time somebody calls her beautiful to her face, she's like, no, my beauty left me when Odysseus left. I know that I'm not beautiful until he comes home. And just like, she can't even see herself as beautiful except when her husband is there, when the person who loves her and takes care of her is there. And that is very, very touching, very significant, where you see like Helen and Clytemnestra try to take matters into their own hands and say like, well, I'm independent, I can do whatever I want, I'll just be with Aegisthus, or I'll just go with Paris if I want to do this. But Penelope realizes, I've made a promise to this man, and my life is bound to his. And because I've made that promise, I can't now forsake it just because it's difficult. Yeah, Christian.
You mentioned one of a very good paper. I'm sure you said that. But you mentioned one of Penelope's slaves, one that she had taken in and whatnot and helped raise and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that the slaves of the house owe any loyalty to Odysseus and Penelope, seeing as even though they are, you know, taken care of, they also are slaves? It's hard to put lipstick on a pig, you know.
Yeah, and that is difficult. From what I've read in history, slaves were more seen as like they're part of the household. They were treated better than like hired servants. Especially in the case of Melantho, she was basically Penelope's kind of had foster daughter almost. Penelope had really loved this girl and had cared for her for so long. And I think because of that love and that care that Melanco does owe Penelope something. Like maybe she doesn't love her, but she at least owes some respect to this woman who had given her so much.
Thank you.
Yes, kind of going back also, beautiful paper, obviously, onto love of Odysseus and Penelope's relationship. Going back to kind of your discussion with Annika and her question, had Odysseus been killed at some point, whether in the Trojan War or, I guess I'll say he was killed in the Trojan War, so Penelope knew that he was dead. Do you think her actions of, you know, the extent that she had, I guess, missed him, like you were talking about, she didn't recognize herself as beautiful or whole with him absent, would that still have been honorable or something to look up to? Or do you think it would be more similar to Dido and Psychaeus, when it would have been kind of rejecting parts of her responsibility? I guess what are your kind of thoughts on that? Had he actually been killed, how would have her attitude, or should her attitude have changed at all?
That's a good question. I think for a time it would have made sense if her attitude was the same, and it would have been, you know, an understandable and even a good thing if she wanted to do as she did. However, I think her situation is a bit different from Dido's in that she has this son and now she needs to raise the heir. So it would have been her responsibility to see that Telemachus becomes the proper king that he needs to be. So that would be, as I bring out, it would be very difficult because if she does get married again, then that puts Telemachus in jeopardy. So I think at least for a time, her mourning would have been appropriate, but she also has these other responsibilities that would call her out of that.
So basically, because she already had an heir, she didn't necessarily have the same responsibility to marry like Dido might have had, since Dido had no heir.
To a certain degree, yes, I think that Ithaca does need a king, but
Yeah.
you know, there's at that point Telemachus was almost a man, so I think her responsibilities in that case would have been
Yeah,
different.
so as a mother first.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yes, Grace.
Okay, so, like Penelope tries to test Odysseus. Do you think he was actually worthy of that after he like cheated on her and stuff? Like, do you think he was like really deserved to pass the test?
I think, and reading this, I think it's interesting that he does get sort of the double test, and I'm wondering if he really needed that sort of as a way to be like, yes, I really remember you, I'm really loyal to you. Sort of like, okay, you know when Christ asked Peter, like the 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And that's because Peter had denied him 3 times, and he needed to say like, yes, I repent of this, and I'm willing to like start again. And I think that almost serves a similar purpose of like Odysseus is like, yes, I failed you, but I'm here now, and I'm willing to reject what I had done in the past and now be who I need to be. Yes.
I just want to kind of take the question in the same direction. Just comparing the memory of marriage to the memory or the feeling of the lotus leaf. I mean, the lotus leaf seems to be pretty much pure pleasure. And, you know, when Odysseus comes back and talks to Penelope, and she says, why has Odysseus been gone so long? He says, well, he's been trying to get together a lot of money, and so he's going to come back with lots of money. He doesn't say anything about Circe, he doesn't say anything about Calypso. And there's probably going to be a time when, you know, when the bards are telling the story that Penelope does find out. And, you know, I was thinking, well, you know, what if you have this kind of sense of identity and memory that's part of marriage, but, you know, what if part of your memory of marriage is the knowledge that, well, you know, when your spouse was on his business trip, he got together with an old flame for dinner. And, you know, you have to remember that too. And so how much of the idea of identity and memory incorporates not just pleasure but pain?
very painful. However, in the case of like Odysseus and Penelope, like that's there. I think it would make a pretty interesting like one act play to hear that conversation between Odysseus and Penelope of like really this happened, like what was going on, what was going through your head. And that's going to be there. And I don't think we can just easily say like, you know, that's over, I'm completely forgetting it, it never happened, I'm just focusing on you, honey. Like, in a way, this is still part of their story, that this is how they got back together. And with the Lotus Eaters, he's kind of like, you could, you know, the Trojan War was awful. He lost so many of his friends. Like, it was just bloody and violent and terrible, and has the opportunity, like, you can forget all of that. You can be at peace again. You don't have to remember how hard it is to be away from Penelope. You can just forget all of it. But then what would he be? He would be nothing. He wouldn't have anything to hold on to. He would just be existing in a void. And I think that rejecting your memory is rejecting part of your identity, because this is part of what has shaped your character. And I think it's interesting, there is a turning point with Kierkegaard. Like before Kierkegaard, that's when he's with the Cyclops, that's when he's like, let's check out this island and like do a little plundering here, or he makes a lot of stuff like let's explore. But after Kierkegaard's like, no, I need to get home. He doesn't let his mind wander of like, oh, that land looks interesting, let's take a peek. He's like, no, I have this goal and I need to get here. And I think that failure almost served as a wake-up call of like, I could really lose this. I could lose who I am, I could lose what I have, and I can't let that happen. So I think in that case, it was almost, I'm not gonna say it was a good thing, but it ended up well for him that it helped him remember Penelope so much more and kept her at the forefront of his mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Yes, Jonathan.
You said that memory is a good portion of your identity. You can't help forgetting things from your identity.
Sorry, that was a little quiet. Could you speak up?
Okay, so you said that memory is the majority of your identity. So close to that.
I wouldn't say it's the majority, but I would say it constitutes part of your identity.
Okay. Would you say that people who can't help forgetting lose a good portion of their identity?
That's difficult. I think that's hard because when you are with somebody who doesn't really remember who they are, you still remember who they are and what they should be, and the fact that they don't know who they are and they've lost this part of themselves is very difficult, because like they're lost and you're hurting because you can see them and you're like, this is not what you should be. So I would say they have, in a sense, lost part of themselves. I wouldn't say they would be completely void of an identity, but they would have lost something. Yes.
Okay, so Odysseus is a full-grown man, and when he left, he was full-grown with command responsibility as the king. And so he was raised with the traditions of his forebears, and also his home. How much do you think that, if you accept that, how much do you think that that affected the suitors?
Oh, that's a great question, and I was hoping somebody would ask. There was a paragraph that I eventually had to cut, sort of about this, because it didn't quite fit in with everything, but it's really fascinating that Odysseus is raised with all these traditions that shape his culture and shape what it means for him to be a man, to grow. Like this is what you do, this is how you treat people, this is how you act. And in the case of Telemachus and the suitors, they haven't had men to say like, look, this is what you've got to do, this is how you behave as a guest, this is how you behave as a host, this is what it means to be a warrior. They haven't had that. And it seems that the suitors have no respect for any of the tradition, wherever they might have heard it. They say like, well, I don't know, I want to do this, so I'm going to do this. But in the case of Telemachus, he has a more profound respect for the traditions governing their culture. And that proved to be a great benefit for him because in the opening he meets Athena disguised as one of Odysseus' old friends, and because he knows how to behave properly as a host, he went and greeted this what he supposed was a man, and he didn't even know who he was. He's just like, you're here in my home, so I need to treat you right. And so Athena in disguise was like, I was an old friend of your father's, you look just like you. Here, I'm gonna tell you all about your dad, and like, I'm gonna give you some good advice. He wasn't, if he hadn't known what it meant, like his responsibilities as a host, then he wouldn't have had Athena's help. So I think that is very important, and that's what sets Telemachus and Odysseus apart from the suitors. Yes, Anna.
First off, love the paper, really enjoyed it. I had a question regarding Achilles, Odysseus' mistake with Kirfi. So, in that case, we all know that he failed in that regard. Penelope was offered many, perhaps not similar since these men were rather unworthy, but many other temptations like that. How do you think the story might have changed if Penelope had failed in the same way?
That's really interesting. I can't say I'm exactly sure. It really would have depended on like, well, how long was this going on? What were the results? Like, what happened? That's a good question. I can honestly say I don't really know. Yes, Monica.
Throughout your paper, I was really thinking about like the phrase like love makes life go fonder, and I was just wondering how you would take that to Penelope and Odysseus.
Like absence? Okay. I think maybe it does. In their case, like, I mean, they haven't seen this person for a long time. They remember how they looked when they first got married, and they have sort of all these hazy memories of like, oh, it was so great back then. It was so great back then, and maybe that did play into some of it, and they were able to just hold on to it. That like this was the man I loved when I was young, or like this was the girl I married. And sure, I'm sure that does play into it some, where they haven't had to live together for so long and have those difficulties that other couples would have had just because they were going through a normal marriage. This hasn't been a normal marriage. Their difficulties have been different, and they've had to face them mostly alone. So I think in that case, it might have played a part of it. Sarah.
Sort of going off of Annie's question, what do you think Odysseus' reaction would have been to Penelope if something had happened and she had cheated on him, not necessarily remarried anyone, but if she had cheated on him, do you think he would have been as faithful to her as she was to him?
I'm not sure. I think obviously he would be very upset and disappointed that this happened. But I think if she is showing him that like she's willing to move past what she did and say like, I failed you, but I want to start again. I want to this was a mistake and I don't want to do this again. And I think in that case, he might have forgiven her. I mean, he's gone through very similar temptations, and he knows what it has been like to fail and to want forgiveness and to want to start again. So obviously there is a tremendous hurt and disappointment in that, but I think it might have played out something like that. Levi.
So I know when going over this story, there's always the question of whether or not Penelope actually knew it was Odysseus, but clearly in your paper you portray Penelope as clearly knowing that he is him at the beginning. So if you know that, then how do you explain the significance of the testing? Was it just to make the story more interesting, do you think? Or was she not 100% sure?
I think in the interview scene that I sort of glanced over, I think she's started out, like, it kind of changes, and you can kind of see in the way they talk to each other. It's just a fascinating interview where she starts like, there's something different about this guy. I don't know quite who he is. Could be a god disguised, could be somebody who knows about my husband, could be my husband. I have no idea. So she knows that there's something very different about him, and so she starts talking to him, and then he starts talking, and then it seems like after she comes back, she realizes like, this could be Odysseus. And I think she begins talking to him as if she wants to believe this is Odysseus, but can't quite. So she goes, well, if you are Odysseus, this is what you have to do. I think it's very hard for her at the end when they're finally reunited to really accept like, wow, the wait is over, he's finally home. Because in the story there have been other people who say like, hey, I've heard news of your husband, and they expect that she's going to like get them a great room and a lot of food, and they'll be well taken care of because they told her about her husband. So she's had all these people lie to her, and she's very wary of that. So I think maybe if she's not 100% certain, she wants to believe that it's him. And so she's like, okay, well, if you are, you know this. And I think that was the purpose of the test, just to sort of give her permission to believe that this really is Odysseus.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hammerling.